Welcome to this session about transformative action to achieve health for all at net zero emissions. I'm Kathy Woteki, a professor emeritus at Iowa State University and former chief scientist and undersecretary for research, education, and economics at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'm also a member of a newly established commission under the global challenge that Dr. Zhao talked about so passionately this morning. And this commission has a lot to do. My role this morning, though, is twofold: to set the stage for the session and to introduce our moderator. There's a considerable body of evidence supporting the need for the world to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050 to ensure that we stay within Earth system's boundaries. Doing so would contribute substantially to health and to health equity around the globe. However, the planning for climate mitigation to date has often neglected to factor in human health considerations. And efforts in each individual sector, whether it's the health sector itself, or food, or transportation, or energy, have too often stopped short of considering how to maximize health benefits in that and adjacent sectors. That insight was the motivation behind establishing the commission that we'll be hearing about in this session, which will be developing a roadmap for government and other organizations to take action that makes health a priority in cross-sector systems changes driving towards net zero. It's now my pleasure to introduce a fellow commissioner and moderator for this session, Dr. Jonathan Patz. He's a distinguished professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and holds the John P. Holton Chair of Health and the Environment. Jonathan?
Kathy, thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure working with you over these years, planning this. I'd like to just echo what Adrian Hollis said in the beginning, in the last session, where I'd like to give sincere thanks and praise to Pope Francis, who passed away yesterday. His landmark encyclical, Our Common Home, was a call out for true transformational change. So I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledge him because he was really an environmental pope. So for context, in 1990, the first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out. There was missing a chapter on human health. Since the second IPCC assessment report was published in 1995, the relevance of health has become clearly evident. And now, 30 years later, as climate change-driven weather disasters, as we saw in the last session, are already upon us, we recognize the urgency for climate action. Our interventions must be two-pronged. First, building resilience to the risks at hand, and second, to moving upstream to address the root of the problem, to cut fossil fuel emissions that are heating the planet while simultaneously utilizing nature-based solutions such as conserving tropical rainforests. We can't continue to mop up the mess on the floor without thinking to turn off the faucet. So, to build resilience while also cutting greenhouse gas emissions, it will require transformative action to achieve health for all at net zero emissions. That's the title of this session. Concepts that you'll hear in this session include moving towards a well-being economy For example, the country Bhutan already has a happiness index, and two criteria are human health and environmental sustainability for all policy decision making. Another concept you'll hear is about a just energy transition. You'll also hear about drivers and approaches to systems change. And finally, the National Academy of Medicine's Roadmap Initiative. You'll hear that in depth. So I want to just introduce our first speaker, who will be online. Do we have Andy Haines online? Okay, so I'll introduce each speaker as they come up. So Sir Andy Haines, he's a knighted doctor. Sir Andy Haines is Professor of Environmental Change and Public Health in the Center on Climate Change and Planetary Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where he was the former dean and director of the school. Andy, over to you.
Many thanks, Jonathan. Just can I first check that everyone can hear me? And could I ask you to put the slides up on the screen,
You sound
please?
good, and the slide looks great.
Well, I can't see the slides, so I don't know whether you can show me the screen. I guess not. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So this slide really is to give you the sort of basic introduction of where we are now. And as you've already heard, the theme of this workshop is how we need to transform the global economy to address inequalities in health, but also inequalities in emissions, and to make sure the benefits of a net zero economy can be shared to all. And let me introduce at the outset this concept of co-benefits. Co-benefits are ancillary benefits, the ancillary benefits that accrue from decarbonising the world economy, from moving away from the burning of fossil fuels to generate energy, power, to sustain our societies, and also to moving towards much more sustainable food systems, because food systems contribute 25-30% of greenhouse gas emissions, but also are a major driver of biodiversity loss. And the slide shows you where we're going at the moment. And approximately we're somewhere between 2.9 and 2.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. It could be higher than that, depending on the actions that are taken over coming decades. But in broad terms, there's an implementation gap of around 25 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, 25 billion tons of carbon dioxide by 2030. So we need to really ensure that the level of ambition is greater. And of course, that's particularly difficult at the moment because there's pushback from many quarters, often based on wrong information, misinformation about the costs and benefits of moving towards a net zero economy. But you can see how far away we are from a 1.5 degree world, which is what was originally envisaged in the Paris Climate Agreement, but now is sadly virtually out of grasp, out of reach. Next slide, please. So, although of course it will take major actions, major transformative actions to move towards a net zero economy, could I have the next slide, please? Can you advance the slides? There are two types of actions that we need to take. One is to adapt to the change that we cannot prevent, because as you've already heard, we've already reached substantial degrees of, I prefer not to use the word warming because it sounds too reassuring, but planetary heating, I would say. Global average temperature of about, 1.5 degrees has already been reached as of the last year, and it looks as though that will be sustained. So we need substantial increase in the funding put into climate change mitigation and adaptation, perhaps around 4 times of what is currently invested, just for the needs of emerging markets and developing countries. That sounds like a lot of money, but you have to remember at the moment we have very large subsidies for fossil fuels and for other unsustainable patterns of living. So transferring those subsidies into financing for a net zero and more resilient economy would be very good investment indeed. So these two types of action, the adaptation actions, which are about better heat wave early warning systems, better disaster preparedness, have to be complemented by mitigation actions, because you can't adapt your way out of this crisis. You have to do both. the longer you leave mitigation, the more difficult it comes to adapt. And of course, there will be limits to adaptation, beyond which humanity in some parts of the world may not be able to adapt. So we need to move towards mitigation actions, which include, of course, decarbonising the energy supply, moving towards sustainable food systems, using more public transport, active travel in cities to enhance physical activity and reduce air pollution. And also nature-based solutions. These embody aspects of both adaptation and resilience on the one hand, with mitigation on the other, because they lock in carbon. Green spaces in cities, protection of forests, agroforestry, a range of other nature-based solutions can help to stabilise the climate, but also potentially benefit human health if they're well designed. Next slide, please. So in order to move towards a net zero economy, we can also achieve very large benefits to human health, not just the benefits of reducing the risk of dangerous climate change, but also the near-term benefits, which come from having cleaner air, for example. A recent estimate of ours with our colleagues in the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry in Germany suggested about 5 million deaths annually caused by air pollution from fossil fuel burning, the very fine particles, the PM2.5, that get deep into our lungs. We also know that physical inactivity is a major risk factor for non-communicable diseases. Some estimates have suggested this could amount to several million deaths annually linked to physical inactivity. And the most effective way of getting the population moving is, of course, in their daily life, which is through their daily activities of transport, going to and from work, school, places of worship, and so on. And finally, the food system. The Eat Lancet Commission suggested that over 10 million deaths annually could be prevented by shifting to healthier and more sustainable diets over coming decades, with a greater consumption of plant-based foods and less processed and red meat. So overall, potentially very major benefits indeed to human health in the relatively near term, in addition to the benefits of reducing the risk of dangerous climate change. Could I have the next slide, please? Many of these actions that we identified in our Pathfinder initiative review, which was published in The Lancet at the beginning of 2024, were modelled actions. And what we were particularly interested in doing was to look for implemented actions, of which we found a relatively small number. And I want to just give you a couple of examples now. First one of these comes from the US, and it's the health and climate benefits of moving from coal and natural gas to renewables from the renewable energy portfolio standards in the US. And you can see nearly 150 million tonnes of CO2 emissions were avoided in 2015 alone because of the increase in solar and wind power generation across the US. And there were substantial improvements in air quality, which led to an estimated between 3,000 and 13,000 premature deaths prevented. And indeed, recent evidence suggests that the relationship between air pollution and non-communicable diseases may even be stronger than some of those that were used for these estimates. Could I have the next slide, please? Another example was from Australia, Victorian Australia, which is a trial called the Victorian Healthy Homes Trial, which upgraded 1,000 low-income households in Victoria, Australia. And half of these were randomised to receive the upgrade before winter and half after winter. And what they did was to document the fact that they saved over 11,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent in a year. But importantly, from the health community's point of view, this also led to several improvements in health, reduced breathlessness, better mental health, and importantly, reduced healthcare costs. So insulating, retrofitting houses with more energy efficient fittings can both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve health. And that's an important lesson for many low-income communities. Next slide, please. Another example was reforms to the transport system, such as this in these changes in Buenos Aires in Argentina, Más Bicis Menos Emisiones, a bike-sharing scheme and cycle lane network, which resulted in the savings of about 12,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions because of an increase in bicycle trips, which substituted for private vehicle use, and also improvements to health, not least because there were fewer cyclists killed in road accidents. They didn't actually quantify the benefits from increased physical activity, but these would have been additional, of course, to these benefits from reduced road traffic injuries. Next slide, please. And then the next example concerns a very interesting project by Health in Harmony, which looked at how improved healthcare can help conserve carbon in a tropical forest in Indonesia. So Health in Harmony went to the communities that were deforesting their local environment and asked them why they were doing that. And the reason they were doing it largely was because they needed the funds in order to pay for healthcare. So what they did was to provide affordable healthcare to this community, and they were able to show that in comparison to another local community that didn't receive the same benefits, about 28,000 people were provided healthcare. There was reduced infant mortality, and as a result, 90% fewer households relied on logging income, resulting in a marked decline in deforestation and the protection of about 600,000 tons of above ground carbon loss. So big win-wins for nature, for the climate, and also for human health. And then finally, the last example. The last example is taken from a paper that my colleague Pauline Shielbeek led based on UK data. And she looked at the benefits to health and to the climate of adherence to the Eat Well guide recommendations, which essentially recommend a diet which is rich in whole grains, in fruits and vegetable consumption, modest consumption of animal products. And she measured the benefits both to human health and to greenhouse gas emissions, using data from over 500,000 participants in biobank data and cohort studies as well. And she showed that there was a 7% reduced risk of mortality and about 30% lower dietary greenhouse gas emissions in those people within these populations that had intermediate to high adherence to these dietary recommendations. So again, win-win strategies. And then finally, the next slide, please. And so what we recognize here is that there are big benefits to both human health and to the environment of well-judged policies. Of course, there may be some trade-offs, and we can come back to those perhaps in the discussion. But many of these benefits are wins for the climate and wins for human health. You'll notice I haven't mentioned the healthcare sector, not because it's not important, but because these other parts of the economy contribute between 90 and 95% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to work across different sectors if we're going to have the desired benefits for climate and for the economy as a whole and for human health. And there are a range of different approaches that are being advocated to integrate benefits to human outcomes as well as to the planet. One of these is the well-being economy, which was mentioned in the introduction. And there's a Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which brings together a number of governments, about 500 organizations, a range of academics, and so on, that are working together to document the benefits of moving towards an economy which focuses on the improvement of human health and well-being, including regenerative agriculture, sustainable transport, renewable energy, food systems, many of the issues I've already mentioned. And on the left, you can see from the Earth for All initiative how, at least in theory, it would be possible to have a giant leap forward for humanity, which would take humanity towards a much more sustainable and healthy future. Thank you very much indeed.
Andy, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Now we're going to dive deeper into energy. We have Professor Dan Kammen. He's the James and Catherine Lau Distinguished Professor of Sustainability at UC Berkeley, with parallel appointments in the Energy and Resources Group, the Goldman School of Public Policy, and the Department of Nuclear Engineering. Dan?
Well, you should just go. I think it makes more sense.
Oh, hang on.
Oh.
No, here we go. We're good. Let's go with Dan.
Thank you all for
guys
being
first,
here. Thanks, Andy and Jonathan, and sorry for our bit of confusion there. So I also, I'm so pleased everyone's here. I had the pleasure to work on Laudato Si. I have to say, I've never received more rapid peer review feedback than at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, where we drafted in the morning, and by dinner, which was glorious, we had comments back, and so worked over dinner on what ended up being Laudato Si. So it's a real pleasure and sort of to acknowledge the passing of this kind of remarkable Pope. So what I'll try to do is to just give a couple comments on what I think I sort of got as the gist or the vibe of the first session, and that was that there are macro questions, and Andy highlighted some of them, and I think we will today, but how does one engage in this time of crisis, particularly in the US, on making good on not only finding ways to backfill what we need to do to continue at this time of real stress on research and academia defined broadly, but also how do people with very different backgrounds engage and find places to plug in on some of the small scale. So my own laboratory is here, and again, I'll highlight some of the connections and things just in a second to put them together. One aspect of the 1.5 degree target, and I've been a member of the IPCC, which I guess the US is departing from since '99, is that this dialogue around the 2 degrees and then 1.5 degrees essentially is based on hard, non-debated science that effectively across the board on each of the major metrics, missing the 1.5, and I would say the 2 degree is also in huge jeopardy, more or less doubles the risk factor. The risk factors to health, the risk factors to our willingness to reach out to each other. In fact, one of the things that I'm most proud of at UC Berkeley is that we have, and I co-direct, a center on climate and environmental justice. And DEI and JEDI are not scared words in California, at least not yet. And I think it's critical for this dialogue because if we don't find ways to broaden the tent and to recognize how incredibly destructive our historic biases and inequalities have been, we don't make the kind of progress that we're talking about in terms of these goals. So just to kind of highlight how these things come together, I do want to start with something that I think should be at the front of every talk and every slide around climate change, and that is the richest 10% of the world, of which, I don't want to make any assumptions for anyone background here or online, but more or less it's likely that almost everyone participating online or in person is probably part of the 10%. And the top 10% is responsible for more than half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. The poorest half, not just in the poorest countries, but the poorest half, the brownest half, the most gender female half of that mixture is the part that is essentially 7%. So half of the world's population, less than 10% of global emissions. So the inequalities compound themselves, and not finding ways to do things like what California did, and that is to devote 35% as a floor of the state's cap and trade revenues in projects in underserved, marginalized communities, is a critical opportunity that on the health side, on the energy side, we need to find more ways to work closely together on. Unfortunately, that's not all of the bad news. The other bad news is that the Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 goals, are, by 2030, are all things that which are under threat. My own preferred area where I work, SDG 7, to have energy access for all of the world's population. There's about 700 million people without today, are under threat. These are the backstory, and this is why we need to broaden that tent, not because of some outreach effort, but because without making climate justice central, we don't make progress. The good news, turning very rapidly, is that on the technology side, we have done, despite all of the problems of funding clean energy, done remarkably well. 90% drop in the cost of energy storage and solar in the last decade, 60% drop in the cost of wind energy, offshore taking off everywhere except for here. So remarkable progress. And what this has meant is that our real grand challenge is how to leverage this in health and other areas far more rapidly than we're doing so far. The remarkable story is that it's now cheaper to build new clean energy power plants than to operate existing fossil plants. And that is a statement that's been true for several years, and yet we have made incredibly low progress because our biases, Jonathan mentioned in a question in the first session, the playbook from the tobacco industry that is now very clearly going on in the fossil fuel industry. So how do we make these go rapidly? And I'll just rapid fire to end my comments. In California, where we have almost 60% of all EVs in the United States, ongoing air quality studies are showing that the air is improving because of those EVs, and of course, clean electricity and zero-emission vehicles, a dramatic downward trend. We're seeing just about 2.5% per year improvement in air quality because of the transition to EVs. It's not something in the future, it is today. Jumping to another part of the story, a place where health and energy have needed to work much closer together and have not done so, is in cooking. And in terms of the gendered aspect, in terms of the fuel, the ecological damages, number of groups have worked for decades on clean cooking. E-cooking is now a possibility for the reasons I highlighted. And the thing I'll end on in my last 39 seconds is an effort that was launched by USAID when I was there in 2021. All of the blue dots are health facilities in Africa. The black line is the grid, which means that about 100,000 of the 170,000 health facilities in the continent do not have access to affordable or reliable electricity. A program put together by USAID, Danish Aid, UK Aid, a number of others, decided to take this on in an effort where a donor community would provide the CapEx for clean energy, solar and energy storage at these clinics, if the countries would come up with the OpEx, often through diesel savings. This effort is an area where I hope we'll come back and talk about it, but it's essentially an effort to design and build health facilities powered by clean energy at scales of small mobile clinics to larger hospitals, and put this together using the latest IT so that we can track oxygen generation, track the cold chain, track all the aspects that we need to put together to provide energy services. As in my opening comments, we are finding this is lower cost than existing healthcare systems. And so I just wanted to highlight a domestic and international example of where this energy health nexus needs to be part of the equation. And we have the tools. We're just at this moment where we're deciding to dismantle some of our smartest mechanisms. So thank you so much.
Dan, thank you very much for that great presentation. Our next speaker is Kelly Levin. She is co-director of the Systems Change Lab and Chief of Science, Data, and Systems Change for the Bezos Earth Fund. Before coming to the Earth Fund, Kelly spent 12 years at the World Resources Institute as Director of Tracking and Strengthening Climate Action. So we are lucky to have you. Thank you, Kelly.
Terrific. Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks so much to the National Academy of Medicine for having me. Today's actually a perfect day for talking about systems change, because you've probably seen the people kind of marching with their placards saying systems change, not climate change. And what does that mean, especially in the context of the transformations that we have been talking about this morning? When you look at systems, and there are so many different ways to kind of slice and dice this. This is a kind of mix of sectoral ones that are the way that we move goods around and what we eat and how we power our homes and cities. And then there are the cross-cutting ones like finance and economics and governance and what have you. But there are tons of different ways to slice and dice this. But when you think about our global systems and what the Paris Agreement, for example, calls for climate change, we need major systems change or transformations. And to give you a feel for the scale at which that's required, if you think about recent rates of a drop of deforestation, to meet our climate goals, they would have to go 4 times faster. If you think about recent rates that we've achieved for phasing out coal power, to meet our goals, they'd have to go 7 times faster. To think about how much we would increase the availability of public transportation, that would have to be increased 6 times faster than recent rates of change. So we're talking about major systems change. And what does that mean exactly? And what it means is basically that it's a often kind of collection of shifts that disrupts the status quo and moves it into a completely new system that kind of challenges the old one. And what's complex here is when you think about what comes together to drive systems change, it's often a series of drivers that come together. And some of them are more durable than others. So if you think about norms change and behavioral change, often that's kind of the root of what you believe is true. And that can be some of the kind of stickiest, as political scientists sometimes call it, of all. But you can think about, changes in innovation and innovation of practices or technologies like the smartphone and the computer and the car, and how much that drove change, incentives and disincentives, and that could be economic incentives or non-economic incentives like subsidies or what have you. Agents of change, which could be an individual leader, the Pope, who changes the world, or a collection of leaders that are acting in a coalition, or mass movements, for example. You think about the design of interventions and how that can, change our outcomes. You think about exogenous change, these kind of windows of opportunities or shocks like wars and COVID, elections that change our world and create windows of opportunity to advance change. And, that combined shapes this dynamism of systems change. And not everything looks like this. This is, what some people have seen before as a kind of S-curve. This is more typical of technological change, but you can imagine it in some other systems. Not everything will look like this, but basically there are multiple different steps of system change, where in the beginning it kind of feels like a total slog. It's almost impossible to believe that change can happen, and there's a lot of stability in the status quo. There aren't really huge questions in terms of the existing system. And then you can think about when you go into takeoff and there are more solutions, more challenges to the existing system, more experimentation. You can move into acceleration where you see those changes getting uptake, and then finally stabilization into this kind of new system altogether, which always has the possibility of relapse, where you would have to have continued momentum to make sure that you don't go back to the old system. And systems thinking in this kind of complex world of multiple systems, multiple drivers of change, is a way that you can kind of break through the complexity. It can help you think through both kind of the root of the problems. It can surface unintended consequences. But basically it helps you look at the system as a whole rather than in parts. It helps you think about the key connections, the key patterns of change over time. It helps you probe assumptions, bring different perspectives together, and that can be helpful when thinking through how do you kind of break through and achieve systems changes. And there are multiple different approaches, some of which might be familiar to you, but here are just a few that the community has used. One, for example, is around system mapping, where you're basically looking at the relationship between actors to look at key leverage points in the system. You're looking at power dynamics. You're trying to understand impacts. If you made change here, what would be the impact somewhere else? There are causal maps, which in many ways are quite similar. It's looking at the relationships between key variables, which can help you think through power dynamics, for example, and if you made changes, what kind of ripple effects would happen. There's something called the multi-level perspective, which takes into account the issue of time and how you get a intervention that might be in what's so-called this niche, little small state of change into widespread adoption later. And it looks at, for example, if you're having a challenge in terms of uptake of a transportation solution, what might be the broader context that you're kind of fighting against? And there's tools called futures inquiry, where you're basically looking at possible and probable futures and thinking through what would it take to get there, what are the risks intended in that, what are the different phases to get there. And I think some of that can be incredibly helpful, but just to boil down some of the key concepts, another way to think through systems change is kind of a diagnostic series of questions that are really, frankly, quite simple. But often we don't embrace it in the types of interventions that we put forward. And most simply stated, let's take, for example, electric school buses, which are really at the intersection between climate change and health outcomes, right? You can think about rolling out a large program on electric school buses and ask, does it address the root causes in terms of inequities of air pollution, in terms of fossil fuel dependence? Is it able to scale and sustain itself? Does it address total cost of ownership parity with diesel? Does it mitigate unintended consequences? What are you going to be doing, for example, with those old buses? Does it address limiting factors, which might be around charging infrastructure and batteries and trained, skilled workers to fix the electric school buses? Does it proactively assess and manage risks, for example, with the school bus technology? We know it creates meaningful co-benefits, as Andy talked about. And does it consider timing? So these could be those windows of opportunity. So I just wanted to introduce a few broad concepts of systems thinking, because we are tackling one of the greatest challenges of mankind, which will require a very new way of thinking. So thanks so much, and looking forward to the discussion, and thanks again for having me.
Callie, thank you so much. That was very enlightening for systems change, which we all need to learn about in a hurry. Last but not least is Judy Rodin, who is Professor Emerita of the University of Pennsylvania and past president of the Rockefeller Foundation. In fact, she was the first woman named to lead an Ivy League institution and was the first woman to serve as the Rockefeller Foundation's president. So we are very lucky to have Judy present. So take it away, Judy.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan, and wonderful to see everyone. I want to thank you and Andy and Kelly and Dan for the excellent discussion that we just heard, because it lays the groundwork and the urgency for the National Academy of Medicine Roadmap Initiative that I'll be describing. I have the privilege, as Victor described, the overall grand challenge of chairing that grand challenge, and this new roadmap initiative is one of the work streams of that overall grand challenge. May I have the first slide, please? What is the roadmap? What is our intent? It is a global initiative, and one that's designed to position health explicitly at the heart of climate change efforts. And you've heard already why we believe this is so important. Its aim is to identify high-impact strategies as well as actionable pathways that can simultaneously do several things: reduce emissions, deliver health gains, promote greater equity, and foster economic resilience and society well-being, certainly no small order. The Roadmap Initiative intends to create a blueprint for systems transformation. And Kelly has given a wonderful explanation of why systems transformation is so essential here. And that roadmap, that blueprint, will show how solutions at scale can be operationalized across the most emitting sectors, and how to build cross-sectoral efforts and collaborations, because they are sorely needed if we're going to effect large-scale systems change. The next slide, please. To design this roadmap, the NAM has convened a very diverse international commission. It represents multiple geographies, multiple sectors, and areas of expertise. And as I noted, the approach is purposely cross-sectoral and systems-oriented. Throughout this year, 2025, the Commission will assemble rigorous evidence syntheses, and you've already heard some of those from my colleagues. It will conduct policy dialogues, consultations, and expert-led workshops. With the workshop participants, we'll be exploring promising strategies, and we'll be identifying both key implementation barriers and the enabling conditions that are required for successful action. The insights that we gather during these activities will directly inform a final roadmap report, which will detail strategies, lay out priorities for actions, really develop clear implementation pathways, and demonstrate critical leverage points for systemic transformation. Then in 2026 and 2027, our efforts will focus on widespread dissemination and also in providing assistance, if we can, in implementation of the recommendations. Slide 3, please. We're delighted to announce that participation is open for registration for all 4 of the 2025 workshops, and our National Academy of Medicine organizers will provide a link after today's meeting, along with a link to a Lancet comment piece coming out this week that will describe the roadmap effort more fully. The first workshop actually is taking place next week, and it lays out the case for the significant benefits both to people and planet for a focus on the specific health-climate nexus in those sectors that are responsible for the most emissions. The second, in July, aims to identify the how. How could this be accomplished? It will focus on behavioral and social variables, economic and financial incentives, technologies, and policies and actions that could accelerate systems transformation. The third workshop, with dates not yet determined for workshops 3 and 4, but the third workshop will focus especially on low and middle income countries, which, as we all know, bear minimal historical responsibility for emissions, yet experience disproportionate climate health impacts. Importantly, these countries represent some of the fastest growing populations and economies in the next several decades. It's our working hypothesis that targeting investments now in sustainable infrastructure and resilient communities in these countries can help leapfrog and change the direction from the carbon-intensive development pathways that were taken by most high-income countries to a different, low-emitting economic and social progress. And thereby accelerate progress towards improved health outcomes, as well as ensuring substantial economic growth and significant emissions reductions. This workshop will prioritize learning from and identifying equitable solutions for low and middle income countries. It will engage intentionally international actors and financing institutions that could enable the transformation and development of climate health investments in these contexts. And finally, the fourth workshop will focus on case studies that have successfully integrated health-centered climate solutions. And Andy has already presented some of these solutions that focus either on adaptation or mitigation or both, but those that could truly be taken to scale, we will especially emphasize. May I have the next slide, please? It's our hope that the Roadmap initiative will achieve its desired impact by charting a successful path towards health for all at net zero emissions. And we believe, and we hope we've convinced you in today's discussion, that this requires moving beyond approaches based on merely incremental progress or looking only at sectoral silos. Rather, to achieve sufficient impact, we must seek and search for a holistic, integrated systems approach. The National Academy of Medicine's roadmap is designed to do just this, to operationalize this transformative vision by offering actionable guidance, proven strategies, and integrated systems-level priorities for decision makers worldwide. It will identify and help to implement place-based interventions at scale and across sectors, and it will help to galvanize broad-based global action toward improving health while driving toward net zero emissions. I'm proud, really with all of the participants in this panel, to be part of that effort. Thanks, Jonathan.
Judy, thank you so much for that synthesis, and it's been extremely exciting working beside you and Andy as co-chairs for this roadmap, along with Kathy and others that have joined now. And I hope we succeed. It's really an awesome vision, and we want to bring in the best minds and across sectors and across different places of knowledge, different sources of knowledge. So I want to start off a Q&A, and I'm going to start with Andy. But Andy, this question is so hard that you might not have an answer. So I'm going to ask you this question, and then I'm also going to ask Kelly a similar question and let her answer first while you're pulling your thoughts together. So Andy, So Andy, from the Pathfinder initiative, were there any conditions that might be considered as common denominators that portended success for any of your five examples or other examples? And while you're thinking about that possibly unanswerable question, Kelly, how much progress are we making in systematic change to address climate change? How might you go about measuring such progress? So I'll go with you first, because I know Andy's struggling with the first question.
Sure. Is this on? Okay, great. I think there are probably two camps. I think all of the data is obviously incredibly bleak, and we heard in the first panel this morning the impacts of that. And we did an analysis in the System Change Lab, for example, that looked at 42 key indicators across the majority of our sectors, and only one was on track to meet our global targets, and that was the share of EVs in new car sales. So as a whole, we are totally losing the battle. On the other hand, and I think Dan's slides really, this came to life, we are seeing pockets of nonlinear change. And I think the question is, can we learn from that? And maybe some of Andy's response will show us what the special sauce is to be able to drive that. But we are seeing some things like renewable energy, EVs, heat pump sales, and we'll see, will the next one be around hydrogen or alternative proteins? We don't know. But can we start to look at jurisdictions around the world where we're seeing nonlinear change and what has enabled them to do that, which is some of the analysis that we're doing. And I think in terms of tracking this, it's important to look at kind of the headline outcome indicators of, where things stand, but also kind of the bottom enabling environment of, how are policies changing, how are corporate commitments changing, how are investments changing, how are kind of behavior attitudes changing, which can sometimes have a signal there that hasn't shown up in the kind of sales of vehicles, for example, but shows that there's some momentum on the ground.
Thank you. Andy, did you come up with an answer yet?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, for, as you said, it's quite a taxing question because the examples that I gave were really quite wide-ranging. And indeed, in the Pathfinder Initiative report, which is available to download from the Lancet website, you will see there is quite a lot of diversity in some of the examples that we found. But let me pull out a few key messages. One, I think, is the importance of health. So I think what's really important is to frame things in a positive discourse, because climate change is often equated to doom and gloom. And yet we know that just telling people climate change is going to be a catastrophe doesn't necessarily motivate the necessary speed and scale of change that most of us, at least in the room here, want to see. So having a positive message, I think, is a really important one and can maybe help to detoxify, if I can put it that way, some of the discourse around climate change. A second issue, I think, is leadership. And that leadership may be national. In the case of some of the previous clean energy initiatives, for example, it may be much more local. For example, in the case of the Victorian Healthy Homes trial that I mentioned, clearly that came from a locally engendered initiative, which I think has implications, much more wide implications for low-income housing around the world. So leadership is important, but another factor that's really important as well is understanding the priorities of local people, and particularly populations that may be disadvantaged. And I think this is a point that Dan Kammen made in his presentation, that at least a couple of the initiatives that I described very briefly focused very much on low-income populations and addressing some key priorities for them. In the case of the Indonesian example, it was the achievement of affordable healthcare. And I think what was really impressive about the work of this NGO, Health in Harmony, is that they practice something called radical listening. So they don't just go into communities and say, this is what we're going to give to you, and be grateful for it. That's not the way to get change. What they did was to listen to why the communities were doing what they did, which in this case was deforesting, and understanding what the motivation for that was, and then addressing the prime driver of the deforestation, which was the need for more resources for a sustainable health, for affordable healthcare. So these, I think, are really important lessons. And the final one, of course, is about vested interests. And we know that vested interests are inevitably going to oppose change because they're making very substantial economic returns out of the current situation. And I think that's one of the problems we're facing at the moment, is we're seeing a response, a pushback by vested interest that have seen their position threatened. So I think it's really important for us from the health sector to keep a positive discourse, to keep a focus on equity, and to ensure that we bring the best available evidence to this debate. Thank you very much.
Great. Andy, per usual, you exceed expectations. Thank you. Regarding the just energy transition, Dan, you're arguing that including diversity and justice makes achieving climate and health goals easier, which seems counterintuitive. From an economic perspective, doesn't this make compliance harder?
So thanks for asking. I think it's exactly the opposite. And maybe this is the physicist versus the economist speaking. As a physicist, adding this constraint, if you want to call it a constraint, I think makes the job much easier. And we've already seen examples of why that's the case. Trying to promote or sell or innovate a new product, call it clean energy, a bigger audience, more minds at work on it are a critical part of the story. And I'll give an example of why I think that this is a systemic change. This is not just in particular. And that is, we did a study along with Google a couple years ago to look at every single solar panel on every roof in the US. And we correlated that with the income of the people in those homes. So this was residential solar, not industrial solar. And what you find is that solar in a community that is more than 51% white home ownership is 30 to 40% more likely to see solar. A black majority neighborhood is 50 to 70% less likely across an order of magnitude of incomes. And I think what you're seeing there is that if you, exactly what Andy said, if you don't change the institutions, you get the same behavior, but with new toys. And so broadening out the community that thinks differently about what mechanisms could we bring solar to households. Maybe we want to think not just about solar for the rich, i.e. a subsidy if you already own a home to put solar on your roof. To say maybe we should think about how does solar get to the community if it is done at the level of not individual households? How do you make it available for renters? And so I think what we're actually getting is the constraint makes this job easier. More minds at work, more ways to approach the problem. And as we've heard in both of the first two sessions, the medical community, I can't speak for the medical side, but on the energy side, we've done a terrible job of selling the benefits of clean energy, of saving forests, of restorative agriculture. And that's because we don't seem to understand the marketing side of this story at all. And by marketing, I mean that in a good way. So I think actually what we see is the more times we diversify input onto this hardest of all problems, we come up with more solutions. So to me, I think it actually feeds back in a very systems transformative way, not adding a constraint makes this job harder.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So, Judy, as a past president of an Ivy League university and past president of Rockefeller Foundation, I'm going to ask you a very tough question. You discussed barriers and enablers, and I want to bring the elephant into the room and ask your advice based on your past wisdom on the current 180-degree effort from the new administration to go backwards on some of these things, on many of these things. And as Andy mentioned, the vested interests are certainly there. Do you have some pearls of wisdom for us as we grapple with this new big challenge in the system. It's a very big, and I'm thinking about the cogs in Kelly's slide. It's a very big cog. What inspiration can you give us?
You thought you asked Andy a hard question? Obviously, this is a very troubling time for us, for our various communities in the United States, and all of the ways that our actions are impacting those around the world. I'm extremely proud of the president of Harvard, who showed leadership among our universities in standing up and being willing to stand out and fight back. In many ways publicly, and in a lawsuit that they filed yesterday with a phenomenal letter from the president, Alan Garber, describing the issues. And so clearly, there are leaders of our most important institutions that are standing up, that will need to stand up and will need to speak out. On the other hand, the issues that we are working on, the issues that we're discussing in climate change and human health, are issues that our colleagues around the world are working on and supportive of, and we collaborate with them, and we must continue, we must redouble our efforts to do so, because we're going to have, at this moment, potentially greater reliance on them, on their leadership, and on their willingness and ability to continue to work with us to carry on these very important fights.
Wow, that's a great answer. So I'm going to ask Kelly one last question about tipping points and then open it up to the audience. So if you're thinking about some questions there, you'll have the opportunity in just a minute. Kelly, the concept of positive tipping points, sort of going off of what Judy just said, you know, where can we find some energy to go forward? The concept of positive tipping points has emerged in the literature and increasingly in public discourse. Can you talk about how this relates to systems change and how we get to the other side?
Yeah. So I think, you know, as that slide showed with the kind of S-curve, where change is so slow and then kind of takes off, I think the question is, you know, how do you make change irresistible and unstoppable? How do you get to that critical juncture where change is just kind of self-propelling? And we see this more on the technology side than with some of the shifts that are not based in technology. So it kind of makes one have to think about what would it take for some of these other types of interventions, but it's not impossible to think through that. And for some interventions, cost is going to be enough. You know, when you get cost parity between, you know, one option and another, it can take off. And, you know, Dan showed incredibly compelling numbers on the energy side. And for some, that will just be good enough. So then the question is, how do you get that cost reduction fast? For some, we know that cost alone is not going to be enough. So think about like alternative proteins, for example. You know, cow is the second most polluting species on Earth, biggest driver of land use change, significant methane emissions, and so on. And then the question is, what would it take for there to be those kind of dietary shifts to something like alternative proteins? For that, cost parity with conventional meat is not going to be enough. We know that it needs to be as nutritious, as tasty, as affordable, and as accessible, right? So then it's about, you know, affordability, accessibility, attractiveness. And if you think about, for example, you know, when we went from, you know, the cassette to the CD to online streaming, it wasn't just because of cost, it was because something became so attractive. And then the question is really, how do we make our interventions so that they continue to provide the services that we need, and linking back to the first panel this morning, really create the kind of a much heightened well-being for the society that we want in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelly. Okay, open to your questions. I see a question here. Oh, That's Michelle. You're going to give me some marching orders?
I have some questions from the online audience.
Oh, great, great.
Came in from Canada. Beyond political will, what might you foresee as critical barriers to scaling successful green initiatives beyond the local level?
Did you all hear that?
The local level.
And then can you give us another one?
Sure. World leaders are not shifting their position away from investing in fossil fuels. Some are U-turning on previous green promises. If science and economic arguments won't change behavior, what will?
Okay, those are big questions. Does anyone want to take the first question?
I'll do a stab at the first one. The second one is a whole seminar, right? So, I mean, I do think that one of the things that got said in the session on wildfires is one of the key features, and that is, if we don't measure something, we're not going to act on it. And I don't just mean we have an academic paper that quantifies or sets up a new set of metrics. If we don't integrate metrics in larger scale planning. So California has something called the Climate Enviro Screen. And so it's 22 indicators of environmental injustice and inequity. It is a organic document. It keeps growing with the metrics, but state funding has to pass through the filter of, is your funding going to areas that are underserved? Is it addressing these issues? Often cited are the science courts in the Netherlands. And it's an old example, but it's been updated with some new focus on climate. I think these are areas where being quantitative, not just in your little epistemic community of people who work on a given topic, but in the broader areas, does give you a base for operation. So it's not a perfect recipe, but unless you build those into the KPIs, the metrics for how does this hospital perform, how are we looking at resilience of communities, how are we integrating not just solar on the roofs of rich households, but on the roof of poor communities. Those metrics do matter, and they do give you a basis to fight back, especially in these incredibly unequal times that we're in right now.
Does anyone want to take that second question?
Yeah, I can take it. I mean, it's a difficult question because I think what moves particular audience, we're not a uniform audience, right? There's been increasingly sophisticated work to see what drives certain audiences to caring about climate, both in terms of the messages, the issues, and the messengers. One linking back to this panel this morning, one area, for example, that's incredibly compelling is extreme weather attribution, connecting the dots, for example, between what folks are facing in their backyard and climate change. There's one organization that would be worth looking into called Potential Energy, where they basically took folks from the advertising world who have now dedicated their life to climate change. And they're taking the tools from what they learned in advertising of selling things to what it would do to drive climate action. And they've been doing a series of polling, largely in the US, but increasingly with the Yale Center on Climate Communication globally, to look at what drives, what kind of messages. And it's very diverse. For some, the jobs message is going to be salient. For some, it's going to be about health. Interestingly, with some of the kind of swing voters that they looked at last year, it was really around loss. It was around loss and love and future generations. So I think the answer probably depends on who you're trying to move. But we are doing more and more interesting research every day to see what are the most effective ways to move people.
Thank you, Kelly. Do we have time for two last questions? Yeah. So our new commissioner, could you please identify yourself? And I'll just tell everyone she ran the Boston Marathon yesterday.
Thank you. Wow.
So
Thank you so much.
we'll take your question, and then we'll close after these two. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Naoko Ishii. I'm a new commissioner and I'm super excited to be a part of that exercise. At the morning session really tell us that we are losing the battle of transformational change. And Kelly asked the right question that if we really want to have transformational change, are they addressing the root cause? And those changes will be sustainable and scalable. So even if we have a shiny example of like a renewable energy, unless we really find a way to how to create a level playing field by taxing the carbon, we can't really win the battle. So to me, the fundamental challenge is that we are in this clash between planetary system and our human economic system, unless we find a way to integrate those externalities into our economic system by either taxing carbon or integrating that the true value for natural capital. Now we are talking about human health. So how to identify and integrate the true value of human capital. So my question for the panel is that to what extent we are ready to think about those, how to update the current economic system. Thank you.
Okay, remember that question, okay? Oh, hey.
Hi, Insay Obit-Witherspoon, Executive Director of the Children's Environmental Health Network. Thank you all very much. When it comes to motivations, in 25 years of trying to protect children and maternal health from environmental exposures and climate, I've never heard anyone on any side of the aisle or any persuasion say, I'm not for children, I'm not for the next generation, and yet our actions don't measure up, at least in this country. So I would love to know thoughts on much more further upstream, like prenatal upstream, and even prior to that, where we know children are being born pre-polluted, and then the multiple arrays of attacks from climate. I mean, the story is tremendous, just to be a young child trying to emerge and live in society today, not even 2030. Where are the indicator intersections? We work on a lot of system mapping coalitions and whatnot, and the actions that have been talked about today are definitely positive and ones that we uplift too, but I don't believe that we are still we're missing an opportunity to highlight the innate motivations that most people have to protect the next generation, but yet our actions don't always line up for exemplifying the benefits to not only economy, health, and justice, but specifically the health of future generations. Because what we now have is a perpetual cycle of children being harmed at younger ages. That is a generational impact that then moves on to the next, whether it's mental health or whatever the implications are, injury, whatever children are living through, that then scars them multiple-fold as they move forward. So I just don't think that I'm not yet seeing where we are lifting up collectively, even in our society here, the actions that will benefit those prongs that I've mentioned. So if you have any of those examples, just for food for thought, would love that.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. Andy, you want to take that last question and then?
Well, yes, I also wanted to comment on the previous question as well. Both the questions very, very important and not easy to answer, of course. So the issue about externalities, the fact that our economy doesn't really price the full cost of the products that we buy is a crucial one, as economists have been telling us for years. And yet we haven't made that much progress in kind of internalizing the externalities, because clearly, again, there are powerful interests that are making a lot of their profits on the fact that these externalities, we don't pay the full economic cost of them. But I think we've actually missed a trick, in a sense, in terms of carbon taxes. And I think the very word tax is often an anathema to many politicians. And so we need to use these words very carefully, and also to ensure that when we do price carbon and other pollutants realistically, we actually recycle the revenues. And I think one of the problems is that people don't see the benefits. They just see it as another tax, taking money out of their pockets and increasing inequalities. So what we need to do, I think, is to reconceptualize some of these pricing mechanisms. And there are a number of studies of ways in which one could do that. For example, 1 or 2 countries have recycled the carbon pricing revenues to reduce healthcare costs, to provide affordable healthcare at much lower costs, or to, for example, provide free public transport in some locations. So if you give something to people that they really want and really value, but you have to understand what that is, of course, in the particular society, then I think we could overcome some of the opposition to carbon pricing, carbon taxing, whatever you want to call it. Nomenclature is really important. Another issue, I think, is misinformation. That hasn't really been raised very much in this particular session, but I do think, we in the health community need to be much more effective about combating misinformation. And I know you have particular struggles with that at the moment in the US, but I do think we need to treat it like an epidemiological problem. How is misinformation transmitted? How does it have its effect? How can we actually tackle it at source? So that, it seems to me, should be a scientific priority of studying mis and disinformation and how we tackle
Absolutely.
it.
So
And then finally, sorry,
we've got
John.
10 seconds, and then I'm going to wrap it up.
Okay, I'll stop. I'll stop there. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm looking at the clock. So I'm going to answer the second question about children. Number one, obviously children are affected, but children have agency and power. And when I look at the court ruling in the state of Montana, children held versus the state of Montana, children are incredibly strong and impactful. The other thing is children need to understand they have agency. And I'll paraphrase Bill McKibben when asked, what's the most important thing an individual can do? He says, don't be an individual. Join your voice, network. And so there's some powerful youth organizations moving forward. I'll say one thing related to a project that is run out of the Children's Museum, Madison, Wisconsin Children's Museum. It's called Caretakers of Wonder. And it's bringing a positive message. And for children less than 5 years old, you must be positive. You don't want to paralyze people, and especially children. So children is a pivotal point. We need to engage them more. The young are the powerful, and we need to align with them and help give them agency. So with that, because Michelle is right behind me, I'll have to close. So if you can help, thank you.
Thank you so much to all the speakers for your really important remarks. I just want to announce that lunch will be in the Great Hall, and we also have space for up to 90 participants for an optional tabletop discussion during lunch in the West Court. And the title of that is An N of One Health Professionals as Climate Champions. We'll see you back here at 1:45 Eastern Time. Thank you.